Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am, as always, delighted to be with you on this Tuesday for the first of two author interviews that I have this week. As we get started, I do want to remind you to like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Really does help the algorithm, helps get the podcast out to more readers. Also, if you want to help the podcast in another way, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation along with a question or a comment if you so choose to. The tip and donation really helps not only this podcast but the network as a whole. That question or comment I am happy to engage with at the beginning of the next episode after I receive it. Love hearing from you. I'm happy to answer probably almost any question, and you can leave comments as well. So again, if you want to help the podcast in another way, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. You see that next to me. You also will see it scrolling along the bottom of the screen throughout this episode. So how is your week going so far? It's Tuesday, so we're off and running on this week. How was your weekend? Our weekend was good. We actually got something taken care of that has needed to be taken care of for like 5 months, but for various reasons we couldn't. It was one of those things where you're in a bit of limbo. You're waiting for things. You're waiting for this has to happen before this can happen, and so then you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting, and so finally after I think it was 5 months, we finally got the big thing, one of the big things on our to-do list taken care of. So that is always a good feeling. And then I had 2 interviews this weekend, which means 2 episodes this week. Had 2 very nice conversations. The first of which, of course, is this episode. The second of which you'll be hopefully joining me for on Friday. So had some good conversations over the weekend. A third good conversation, because I talked to my mom. I almost always talk to my mom on Sundays. We do video calling so that we can see each other, and her video call is hilarious because it will just pan. She's the only one in the house most of the time when I talk to her. Sometimes my brother will be there or some of my nieces, but usually it's just my mom. And so the camera will just pan, and it will, like if there's other people in the room and they start talking, the camera will pan to the person who's talking. But this just randomly pans, so we make all kinds of jokes. Sometimes we think it's cars driving past and the reflection, that's what makes the video call. But my whole point was that we do video calls so that we can see each other, since we do live on different continents. And that was nice to, spend my time with her and find out what's going on in her life and catch up a little bit. So just, it's lunchtime for her and Sunday evening for me. So it kind of wraps up my weekend, and then right before I go to bed at the end of the weekend. But that's what I know about that. Let's talk about this week's book. This week's book is by Ellen Birkett Morris. It is called Beware the Tall Grass. Let me go ahead and give you the description of the book. Beware the Tall Grass weaves the stories of the Sloans, a modern family grappling with their young son Charlie's troubling memories of a past life as a soldier in Vietnam, and Thomas Boone, a young man caught up in the drama of mid-60s America who is sent to Vietnam. Eve Sloan is challenged as a mother to make sense of Charlie's increasing references to war, and her attempts to get to the bottom of Charlie's past life memories threaten her marriage, while Thomas struggles with loss and first love before being thrust into combat and learning what matters most. Beware the Tall Grass explores the power of love and mercy with grace and artful sensitivity in a world where circumstances often occur far beyond our control. So that, as I said, is the description of Beware the Tall Grass. You probably gathered from that description that it is dual point of view and dual timeline. Eve's stories are told in more modern, not exactly current. I think it's back maybe a decade. I can't remember the exact year. I apologize. Set in the Washington, D.C. area. And then Thomas's timeline and point of view are from the 1960s, first growing up in Montana and second in his time in Vietnam. And for me, we talk about this a little bit, but If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I grew up in Montana, and I actually went to school in Missoula, which is where Thomas is from. I went to college in Missoula. It's 75 miles-ish from my hometown. So when I picked up the book and it said something about Missoula, I was like, wait, what? It's just not a word that you often see. And so I get excited when I see it. But a little fangirl moment for my Montana roots. But let's go ahead and start the conversation with Ellen so you can hear more about the book. Again, it is called Beware the Tall Grass, and the author is Ellen Birkett Morris. Hello, Ellen, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to have you. Excited to talk about your novel, Beware the Tall Grass. But before we get to the book, if you would take just a moment to share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Absolutely. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm a multi-genre writer, so I have a couple of poetry chapbooks, a book of short stories out, and then this novel. And I also do freelance work. I do author interviews for the Southern Review of Books and for authorlink.com. And I am a part-time media consultant for the Kentucky Foundation for Women, which supports feminist art for social change across the state. So
Oh,
a lot of exciting stuff happening in Kentucky that
yeah,
you might not know about.
yeah, lots of other tangents we could go off and talk about just from
Yeah.
that. I will say, do you have a preference when it comes to being the interviewer or the interviewee?
It's good either way, really. I love talking about my work, in the hopes that people might discover it. So I'm always glad to do an interview. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a little different though, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the book, like I said, is Beware the Tall Grass. It is contemporary and historical fiction, dual timelines and dual points of view. So can you give an overview of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the story of a mother whose very young son has disturbing memories of having served in the Vietnam War, and contrasting. And so her point of view is her attempts to unravel what's happening with this boy that she loves very much, who she hopes she could give a perfect childhood to. The other point of view character is a young man named Thomas who grows up in mid-60s America in Montana on a ranch, suffers a really deep loss, signs up to go to the Vietnam War, and then subsequently is really challenged by what he finds there. So I alternate between Eve and Thomas, and the mystery being, what is the connection between Charlie, Eve's son with the memories, and Thomas, the soldier, who's living out the actual experience of being on the ground in Vietnam?
Yeah. So there you have a bit of an introduction to the book itself. We are going to take our first break, but it's dual timeline, dual point of view, as I mentioned at the beginning. So that really does give you that juxtaposition between Eve's story and Thomas's story. Eve and to a certain extent Charlie, because he is a large focus of the book, his experiences that Eve is trying to figure out what to do with. But they're two such different people. Eve, a young mom, modern, more modern era, trying to figure out everything that involves with first-time parenting. Thomas, a very young man who is thrust into a situation he's absolutely not ready for, unprepared for, and it definitely makes for different, interesting juxtapositions between those two timelines and stories. But let's go ahead and take that first break of the episode. When we come back, Ellen will be sharing her inspiration for the novel. Stay tuned. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my
my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Ellen Birkett Morris. Before the break, we were talking about the dual timelines between the main characters of Eve and Thomas and just the juxtaposition of those timelines. Let's go ahead and return now to the conversation with Ellen. And you mentioned this in your acknowledgement section in the end of the book, your inspiration for the story. Can you share that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in the car with my husband in 2014, and a story came on, and it was about the University of Virginia Medical Center's program, which actually explores the experiences of children with past life memories. So they will take the accounts from the kids, and if the kids said, well, I died on this ship on this date, my friend Davy also died, they'll go and look at news accounts and attempt to corroborate the facts that they're hearing. And in a strange number of times, they actually can do that. You know, those things will line up. So it was just, I was so intrigued by the idea, in part because I feel like life is so mercurial and we often end up living lives that we don't expect to live. And so the concept of it just really fascinated me. I was a short story writer at the time, so I wrote a short story. It ended up in Upstreet, the journal Upstreet. And then I took it to a writing workshop, and the leader there said, this is a novel. And I thought, well, ooh, okay, I don't know how to do that. So that's when the dual point of view character of Thomas came in. I knew that I couldn't make my very short story into a novel, but I thought if I added a point of view character and then the inspiration of adding a soldier, which just deepened both sides of the story in ways I never expected. So then I was kind of off and running, with the main challenge being how are these stories connected? And really, I told myself when I started writing that I was under no obligation to explain reincarnation or past lives. But my real obligation was to take you on a journey with these individuals to show their experience with the concept. They're grappling with the challenges that were in front of them. And my job was to artfully weave those stories in a way that would offer up some sort of explanation.
Yeah. And it's I think the way you did it was great in terms of Charlie's experiences, because Eve, his mother, is really trying to advocate for him and figure out what's going on. And her husband is more like, it's a phase, he'll grow out of it. And as a reader, you can absolutely see both sides. Like, as a reader, you're really rooting for Eve because she's trying to figure things out. And she's very upset that her son is having these horrible experiences. But on the same side, you keep putting yourself in that position. Your son is 3. Your first thought is not going to be past life, right?
Right, exactly. So yeah, so that was figuring out ways to realistically portray those dilemmas, to up the dramatic tension in the family, partly by giving her husband Dan a backstory that involved a certain amount of skepticism about things that are mystical, so that his objections or his inability to see what she saw would make sense because he has personal bias based on some family experiences that he had. And really research was integral to, building her part of the story. What would the steps be if you're looking for assistance for your kid logically? And then I picked a very vivid and dramatic battle in Vietnam and sort of wrote Thomas towards being on the ground in that place at that time, using soldiers' blogs, historical accounts, and a source which was "We Were Soldiers Once and Young,"
Mm.
which is a beautifully written story written by a commander and a soldier who served under his command, and that was really great because that showed me kind of like we'd be here, then we'd be here, then we'd be here. So I had a roadmap for both sides of the story. Then the question was to sort of imagine myself into what their experiences would be like.
Yeah. And even at the beginning of the book, I think as the reader, you're almost trying to make it more quote unquote logical, because like it's like, is this a dual point of view? Because this is this is a grandfather, or we're getting a story and somehow it's going to come together in a different way.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah.
But
People often, that's the question they'll ask is what's the direct connection between the two? And I'm thinking,
there's
read the book. I'm not going to tell you.
yeah, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So why Missoula? And I will just say that's where I went to college. I grew up 75 miles northwest of Missoula. So when I pick up a book and the first sentence says something about growing up in Missoula, I'm like,
Wait a minute. Yeah. So Missoula, my sister lived in Missoula. She
okay.
ended up traveling for a job she was doing. She landed there. She was doing some lobbying work and loved it and stayed for many years. So I had an opportunity to go there. And, I just thought I was looking for something distinctly American. And,
Mm,
a ranch in Missoula seemed perhaps a ranch outside of Missoula seemed perhaps like the place I might want to go for that. Also, I think we think of that area particularly as perhaps being kind of isolated in some respects.
mhm,
So Thomas goes from this very, in some ways, insular childhood, on the farm and in his high school out into the world, into the middle of a really dramatic, really vivid battle, So he's leaving behind the peace of mountains and streams and, the kids he knows at school, and he's going into a completely different environment. So really great opportunity to see, to to test like which of his qualities are going to remain true in both environments. How is he going to deal with being tested in ways that he never dreamed of? So, but yeah, my sister is the reason for that. Yeah.
And I was kind of grinning to myself when you said isolated and absolutely correct. But for me growing up, that was the big city.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
my
Yeah.
hometown is
Get it.
1,000 people on a good day. So Missoula is
Sure.
where you
Sure.
go to shop. So,
And
for isolated, my child would have said, no, that's a city. It's not a
right,
city.
right. I get
Not a
it.
city.
That's so great.
Were there any challenges to write? I think we've covered it a little bit, but writing those dual points of view and bringing them together cohesively.
And there really were, it took me 8 years to write. So I really allowed myself the time to begin to suss out the connections between the stories. I also wrote Eve Thomas, Eve Thomas, Eve Thomas. So I alternated sections so that I would try to build in sometimes unconscious, sometimes conscious echoes between her story and his story.
Mhm.
So, for instance, there's a point about midway through the book where everything is going well at home, the dishwasher's running, Charlie's not having any troubles, there's peace, and she's
Mhm.
wondering, could this peace be lasting? Thomas is in Vietnam. He's on night watch. He wanders away from his post as he knows he shouldn't, runs into a deer, feeds the deer peanuts. It's the most peaceful moment he has while he's in Vietnam. So again, they both get a brief pause. They both get a moment of peace, but really trying to make sure there were echoes between the two sections, because then a lot of what connects the story will be a product of the reader's imagination as they note, as they begin as those echoes build and
Mhm.
meaning begins to build. And so that was really the challenge. It was fun to do. It was very intuitive, but it just took a long time,
I can imagine. So I'm sure it was probably incredibly challenging to write in those echoes. And as a reader, I know I consciously noticed some of them, but I'm pretty sure I mean, unconsciously, I think you notice them as well, if that makes sense, because it just ties things together in ways that you might not really even be aware of as the reader. But like I said, I can imagine that it would definitely have been a challenge as the author. And we're going to take our second break of this episode. But when we come back, Ellen will be talking about editing in terms of those challenges. What, did it require some editing to make sure that the flow was still right to incorporate those echoes? You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Ellen Birkett Morris about her novel, Beware the Tall Grass. Before the break, she was talking about, again, that dual timeline with Eve and Thomas and trying to create deliberate echoes between those two timelines to weave the story together. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Ellen. Was there a lot of editing just to make sure that everything matched up? And
there was some degree of editing. I have a wonderful editor at Columbus State University Press, Alan G, and he helped me with some of that. One of my blurbers actually caught a time reference that had to do with the DC part of the story where Eve lives, and he was like, "Hey, wait a minute, this would really have happened then," which is great because as much as I love writing stories, I'm not the world's most detailed person. I can do emotions and I can do drama, but dates and figures and all of that is not exactly my my strong suit. But yeah, there was a decent amount of editing. Also, I should say, for other writers out there, a pivotal thing for me was that at a certain point I invested in a developmental editor. So the book was good. I had sent it to the Jordan Prize twice. One time it didn't get accepted, and I thought, I'm close. What am I missing? And then I thought, who's going to know what I'm missing? And it's going to be an editor. It's going to be a professional editor who's worked for a big publishing house, or perhaps an agent who's now working as an editor. And so I invested in that, and their changes weren't dramatic at all, but they were small things like turn up the volume in this scene, make this a bit more dramatic, maybe line by line things like, well, this thing you're trying to get at here isn't quite landing, so it was useful in that way. I was able to polish it to the extent to which it would make the grade, when I sent it back through.
Mm-hmm. Your point about not necessarily being detail oriented, I think, is a good one. Even if you are detail oriented, it's very hard when you're in the midst of a story to see it as readers are going to see it. I was listening to a book today, and my husband was laughing at me because I started yelling. I had my earbud in, and he's like, because they were talking about a car accident in 1995 being caused by someone reading a text, and I was yelling at the book.
Yeah, wait a minute,
and I just sometimes you as a reader wonder, how did no one catch that? Like author, editor, beta readers.
Yeah, and that's what writers groups are for. I have a bunch of groups, and often they're like, wait a minute, I don't quite get it, or this is missing or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, writers groups I know are incredibly helpful. When it comes to character development, do you have a really good understanding of those characters before you start writing, or do you prefer for them to develop as you write?
I develop them as I write, but I really do it in a way that sort of the development of the character is really integral to what's going to follow. So in Eve's case, I had this big idea. this kid with past life memories. So what's going to push against that in the biggest sort of way? It's going to be a mother who wants to give their kid the perfect childhood, who wants their child to be a blank slate. So I knew then who Eve was going to be: perfectionist, somewhat anxious, somebody who
Mhm.
didn't have a good childhood herself and desperately wanted to give her kid a childhood that's free from this kind of these sort of strange struggles and terrors, and but and also that she was going to be like really courageous and steadfast and
Mhm.
smart, so once I figured out who she was, I knew that my job in that part of the story was to create obstacles to her biggest desires, to push back on all her traits. you know she wants stability, so things are going to become unstable in the marriage, those kinds of things. For Thomas, he was a bit more of a blank slate in many ways, but one of the phrases I came across when reading about the Vietnam War was that a lot of these young men were just plucked out of factories and off of fields and sent to Vietnam, really innocent. And so I really wanted him to be very innocent in a way, but also very principled. He's a
Mhm.
kid who does the right thing, the hard thing. And so, I establish him early in the book as somebody who makes hard choices and takes care of people he loves. And then I put him in a situation where it's going to be asked of him again and again and again. So we're going to see, will he meet this challenge? Um, so having a really clear understanding of their motivations, of their desires, who they wanted to be in the world, and then specifically setting up situations designed to test who they were. So when I teach classes on this, I talk about A Christmas Carol, about Scrooge, how
Mhm.
Scrooge is set up as a very particular character, and everything that happens after that is designed to get him out of that mindset and test those characteristics and broaden his mind and heart. And that you see it, if you look for it, you see it in literature everywhere. And so as a writer, if you reverse engineer it, that's what you do. Who are they? What do they believe? What situations are going to test those beliefs and test those personality traits in a way that's going to be dramatic and satisfying and ultimately lead to some greater knowledge or change or just some greater understanding of the world.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, you've touched a little bit on research. Were there any elements of research that surprised you or that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, yeah. Some of it I kind of expected, like the past life forums, you'd see the kind of stuff that you'd see on TV, which is, some people are kind of scammers and they're trying to
Mhm.
convince people that they can connect them with their past and that sort of thing. Um, and soldiers' blogs they were kind of surprising and useful, and you could see that regardless of the conflict, like when it was happening, that there was a certain sort of mindset and a certain sense of duty and a certain sense of claustrophobia that came with people when they were in service and having to deal with the things they're dealing with. And then, my uncle, my father's brother, who served in combat in Vietnam, he was kind enough to talk to me a little bit about his experience in Vietnam. And that was the most useful and surprising in that he talked to me about the physicality of it. So how hot it was, what it would be like to be how wet your feet always were, what it would be like to be in a foxhole with, bombs going off overhead, mosquitoes, grass that would cut you as you walked through it. Really vivid details that really helped me get in a place where I could describe those physical challenges. And it's all of that is by way of authenticating detail. I think it was the writer Claire Keegan who talks about authenticating detail, all of which, you know, helps the reader feel like they're in the story and gives it all credibility in a way that not having that sort of detail, having a more generic depiction would mark, right? So he was very, very helpful.
Yeah. Wow. I'm sure that was powerful for both of you. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. One thing that strikes me when I think about the Vietnam War is that for my childhood, it wasn't that far in the past. It was still very, very close. And then as I'm reading the book, I kept having to remind myself that it was actually, half a century and more. The end was half a century. The beginning was 70 years ago. That's,
Yeah.
to me, that's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I know it seems I think we may be contemporaneous here because same for me. And I almost feel like, I mean, this year this book came out, Kristen Hanna's The Women, Alice McDermott's Absolution. I think and on all of these are about female perspectives in some respects. I mean, there's some female perspective involved, but I think we're ready as a culture to begin to look back and deal with it because it was just so hot a topic up
Mm,
until now. Now we've got a little bit of distance and people are maybe a little more willing to delve back in and say, okay, what was that? What was going on?
yeah. Well, it was the
Yeah.
first war that was really on everyone's televisions all the time, every night. It was just a complete different mindset.
Yeah.
So,
And people weren't used to seeing it. So we're kind
mm-mm,
of used to it now, sadly, but yeah.
sadly, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The news coverage of the war in Vietnam really did change the way we reported on news, the way we learned about war, etc. But it's also interesting to me what Ellen was saying about the timing of writing about the Vietnam War and kind of the timing of historic fiction in general, I guess, what I could take from that conversation. And yeah, if you've been with the podcast for a while, you know that World War II books are everywhere, and that's what I can't do math right now, but less than 100 years ago. It's not yet there, but quite a ways in the past. Still, we have a few survivors still from that war. It's just really interesting the way the collective memory and the collective understanding of certain events is maintained, is altered, and how writing trends kind of go along with with that collective memory. I don't know. Not something I'd really thought about before, but very, very interesting. We're going to go ahead and take our next break. When we come back, we'll be talking about writing across genres in terms of short stories, poetry, novels, etc. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Ellen Birkett Morris. As we get into this next segment, just another quick reminder that if you want to support the podcast, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info and leaving a tip or a donation. Again, you can also leave a question or a comment, but helping or leaving a tip or donation really helps not only this podcast, but the entire network. And it helps us to get more content out to listeners, viewers, readers, such as yourself. And every bit of support, no matter what form that support takes, is always greatly appreciated. Before the break, Ellen was talking about, well, we were talking about the collective memory of the war in Vietnam and how that influences when and how you might write about it as a historical fiction author. So let's go ahead and return now to the conversation with Ellen. You write short stories and poetry. This was your first novel, is that correct?
Yeah.
Um, if you can sum it up quickly, differences between like do you write novel for you personally, how do you write novels differently than your other writings?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is that you're offering up an extended argument or an extended metaphor. So short stories in some ways for me are easier because I'm able to get in and out, and they can have objects or symbols or images in them that are resonant, that can kind of leave the reader with a feeling or an emotion. With this, I had to carry that load for a much longer time. So but I still sought to sort of use objects or places or embody the story. So the title, Beware the Tall Grass, you know, it's used in both parts of the narrative, and it holds meaning in both parts of the narrative, both for Eve and for Thomas. So, I do think it's helpful for writers who might be attempting to do something novelistic to have a sort of overarching metaphor or image that they can anchor themselves to as they're going through the process of doing the writing. So for me, that became that tall grass, which holds danger, whether it's a young boy who's in the tall grass or a soldier. So that helped. I'd say patience is a real part of it, and really giving yourself the time you need for the story to unfold in a way so that you can understand it. And that rush we want it to be done. We hope for perfection. I sent the novel out at many different junctures when it just absolutely wasn't ready. I even at one point acquired an agent who sent the book around, and he was not completely ethical. He was using my query letter to query editors. He didn't suggest any changes. He was kind of taking this unformed thing and seeing if anybody would bite, versus saying to me, "Hey, wait a minute, I don't think you're quite there yet." He had for 9 months. So, I guess the other thing I would caution folks is like, give yourself time, take the time it needs to make it as good as it needs to be. I mean, I was a journalist for a long time, and you get addicted to publication. You get addicted to wanting things to be in the world, but it needs to be ready. It needs to be right. So that for me, as an impatient short story writer, was the greatest challenge of doing a novel. Yeah.
Oh, I can imagine. For your short stories, do you tend to have historical fiction, more contemporary, a mix thereof?
I have a set of short stories that's just now going out of print that I'm hoping to find somebody to reprint, called Lost Girls, and those were circa 1976. I get the bicentennial, and around the time of the bicentennial. So all of those had a very, very 70s vibe, and they were loosely linked stories set in a small town in Kentucky, all about the experience of women and girls. And a couple of those stories even went, a little further back in time. But all of them were meant to be set in the same fictional town in Kentucky. So yeah, so I did, there, particularly the 70s, I think, because of growing up then, I have well, there's a shorthand there. There's all kinds of things we all remember from that time. So I felt very comfortable setting the stories there. Now, currently I've got a collection of short stories I'm sending around that are themed around the theme of home, and those are contemporary. Those are not historical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love reading things that are historical, but there's still enough in my lifetime that there's moments of, oh yeah, I know what that is.
Push button telephone.
Exactly. My last interview, we were just talking about rotary phones.
Oh, yeah.
So, what are you currently working on? You're querying short stories. Are you working on anything else?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel. It's the story of a young woman from Cleveland whose mother has ALS. They're very, very close, and she gets an internship to go to Hawaii to study the stars. So she gets embroiled in a romantic triangle, and controversy at work, and a celestial discovery. And it's as light and fun. I mean, it's got some big ideas in there, but it's as light and fun as this one is serious and dark. So, yeah.
Yeah. Serious and dark, but there's a lot of light and hope we woven through it, though. I think that,
Thank you. Yeah, and some humor, I think,
yeah.
periodically. Yeah.
So, um, you've been a journalist, so you've written in a few different capacities. Did you always want to write, or how did you decide? And how did you decide to write for publication?
Yeah, I always wanted to write. And, I still have a thing I wrote when I was a kid that's online paper bound with ribbon, but the truth is I was really afraid to be a creative writer. I was afraid to be bad at it. So
Mhm.
I stalled and I did journalistic writing. And I'm working for the Business Journal locally, and I'm writing about buildings and square footage and all that. And it was just soul killing, honest to God. And I thought, if I'm ever going to do this, I've got to give it a try. So in my mid 30s, I started to try creative writing. I started writing for kids. It was so challenging. Like, children's writing has to be so perfect that I thought, I don't have the chops to do that. So I started writing poetry, wrote a lot of bad poetry, wrote some decent poetry, got some published, ultimately published a couple of chapbooks of poetry. One's called Surrender and the other's called Abide. And then worked my courage up to do short stories, began to get publications there, then wrote, a linked set of short stories. So very incrementally working my way towards getting comfortable with something like a novel, and kind of stretching my skills, which I think is just symptomatic of the way I approach things in general. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
But all links in a chain leading you here.
absolutely. Yeah, very helpful. Yeah.
I think bad poetry is such a it's actually a helpful thing. It's I don't know, a form of therapy in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Dreams of it.
you've mentioned a few things that you think are beneficial to other writers, but what other piece of advice would you give for aspiring authors?
Oh gosh, I think the thing I'd say above and beyond anything else is, as writers, we have a lot of hopes that we're going to be discovered by somebody, or somebody's going to advocate for us in some miraculous way. And certainly writers help other writers, and I've experienced that kind of great help and mentoring. But the truth is, the thing that's fueled me the most is my own belief in myself, my own belief that I'm my own best advocate when it comes to my writing, that it's up to me to learn what I need to learn, to get the feedback that I need, to send the work out, to follow up with people, to hire the help that I need to get a greater understanding of my work. So I think having a sense of real ownership over your journey, and not waiting or hoping that, somebody else is going to give you that boost that you need, but building community, getting to know folks, thinking about all the places you could send to work, thinking about all the ways that you can get the work into the world, and doing all that yourself. I just don't, which means submitting, even though it's hard,
Mhm.
getting your courage together and submitting vociferously until you find the editor who likes your voice, and all of that. And so that would be my biggest takeaway, is to play a really active role in your own development as a writer, and in your own promotion, and all of it, all of those steps, all the steps of it, as difficult as so many of them can be, is to be up for that yourself, and to know in your heart that, you're the person who's going to best advocate for yourself. So,
Mhm. Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I like Ellen's phrase of submitting vociferously. I think that sounds like the name of a book. A book that could probably go in a lot of different directions. But in this case, we're talking about, advice for authors submitting vociferously. And as usual, I think that advice for aspiring authors can apply to a lot of different places in life, especially the advocating for yourself. And, no one advocates for you better than you. So make sure you know what you're doing and at least understand the process so that you can advocate better for yourself in all of the areas that are involved in publishing. At any rate, we're going to take our final break of this episode. When we come back, what has Ellen been reading? You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review podcast and my conversation with author Ellen Birkett Morris. Before the break, Ellen was giving her advice for aspiring authors, which included advice that's good in a lot of different situations, which is know what you're doing and be your own best advocate. And let's go ahead now and go to the conclusion of this conversation. When you take time to read, just for you, not necessarily for research or anything else, go to authors and genres.
Oh gosh, yeah. I read a lot of contemporary fiction written by women. So Elizabeth Strout is a huge, huge favorite of mine. I love her. Lily King writes beautiful stuff. Right now I'm reading Claire Lombardo's latest. I can't think of the title of it, but I like is it Louise Penny, the one who writes the Armand Mosh mysteries?
Yeah.
I'm very excited to get my hands on her latest. I'm currently reading Ina Garten's autobiography because I love to cook, and so I'm really interested in her story, her kind of origin story. Also, I've enjoyed the work of a woman named Deanna Rayborn, who wrote a book called Killers of a Certain Age about female older, like women who were in their like early 60s who were on a hit squad together. It's really fun, and
that sounds made up, and yet.
Yeah, and it is. It's total fiction, but it's really fun. That was her first book. Her second one's coming out in April, and I've got an advanced copy of that. And so they're making their way through Europe, again, doing more hits and all that. Again, as far away from my own existence as possible, but kind of amusing,
It feels wrong to say I love it, but yet I love it.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, here we go. Killers of a Certain Age. So here we go. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I asked that question knowing that never in a million years am I going to be able to read all of the books that everyone tells me about, but I still like to hoard them like, a book dragon. In terms of, if you want to know more about you and your works, I know you have a website, so share your website and any social media you're active on.
Yeah. So that's ellenbirkettmorris.com. You'll find links to all my stuff and links to events. I really need to update the events page, so don't pay too much attention to those things that have already passed. And I'm on Threads, and again, it would be under Ellen Birkett Morris. I'm on Instagram at the same name, and on Facebook, I have both a personal page and a writer's page. So I believe that's Ellen Birkett Morris Writer. And I just deactivated my Twitter, so you will not find me there. Yeah.
All right. Do you have a newsletter or anything that people can
don't, I'd really rather spend my time writing fiction than doing that. Yeah.
Understandable.
Yeah.
Ellen, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure that you highlighted during our time together?
I guess if it's okay to do, I wanted to hold the book up. The cover
Yeah,
is so beautiful. It
it
was
is beautiful.
designed by Peter Andrew Selgin, who's a writer himself, who's got a book that's just out from Regal House. He's a graphic designer and a writer. They had me give him text, and he came up with that, and I couldn't have been happier. So I did just want to make sure people knew what it looked like in case they came across it. And other than that, I feel like we've covered a lot of great ground.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, not only about the book, but everything else. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was lovely.
And thank you once again to Ellen for joining me to talk about Beware the Tall Grass and writing and life in general. As always, I am greatly appreciative to all of the authors who join me on the podcast. And it's always fun to meet a new author, someone that I haven't read before, and just find a really compelling novel such as this, because it's definitely a concept that I had not read before. Obviously, dual timelines and dual points of view I've read, but the idea of the past life, it's not new. You've maybe read novels before about this subject, but the way she presented it and the connections between Thomas and Charlie and Eve and those echoes that she talks about, and also some things that we didn't even talk about in terms of Eve and her husband's families and those situations. We covered that a little bit, but then also Eve's relationship with her mother and her best friend also play some roles in giving a lot of that backstory. And just there's a lot of different layers and nuance to the story, and it's really, really well told and very well written. And so if you are a fan of historical fiction or dual points of view, or just a unique concept and maybe something that you haven't read before, you should definitely check out this novel. Again, you're going to hear me say it a million times over the next several weeks, but we're getting into gift giving occasions, and you might want to give someone a really good book, and this might be that really good book. Maybe that someone is you and you want to gift it to yourself, but definitely check this out. And also her short story collections, some of her poetry, maybe that's more your speed too, so you have another author to check out if you are a fan of either of those genres. So thank you to Ellen, and thank you to you. As I mentioned before, this is my first of 2 episodes this week, so the next episode will be coming out on Friday. I have another returning author this week. This is Kevin's 3rd time on the podcast. Kevin Moore will be joining me. The first 2 times we talked about the first 2 books in a paranormal kind of horror-esque series with a main character called Jack Kelly. We're switching gears. So not only is he my second interview of this week, he's also the second Christmas themed interview to grace the podcast this year. So I need to double check, but I think I only have 2 Christmas themed books that I'm talking to the authors of this year. So this is a collection of short stories, all with Christmas as a theme, but also there are some other themes and connections between those stories. So please do join me on Friday's episode to hear this conversation with Kevin. In the meantime, if you are a fan of this podcast, here's my weekly, or twice weekly this week, pitch. If you're a fan of this podcast, please do help out the algorithm by liking, following, subscribing on whatever platform you're either watching or listening to the episode on. Again, it's really helpful, as is leaving a positive review. That does not have to be complicated. I say it every week because I'm an overthinker. Don't overthink it. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it really does help the podcast. And I'm greatly appreciative of getting this podcast out to more people. So thank you to those of you who have already liked, followed, subscribed, and left that positive review. Very, very appreciated. Thank you. Do that for your authors as well. If you read a book that you really love, get that positive review out into the world, because it helps other people find those books and it helps authors. If you are on social media, you can follow the podcast on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Again, I love hearing from you, so come hit me up and tell me all of your bookish thoughts. I hope that you are having a really great week. I hope that no matter what this week has given you or will give you, that it tries to give you as much time as humanly possible to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks, and I'll see you on Friday.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to